As the dust settles on this year's 30th Conference of the Parties, also known as COP30, which took place in Belém, Brazil, one thing is clear. The momentum to get clarity for climate action is growing stronger. Although not on the official agenda, climate finance was the spotlight at COP30, with discussions focused on how countries would deliver the promise of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance that was adopted in Baku last year, including scaling up the provisions of public finance under Article 9.1 of the Paris Climate Agreement. Despite political headwinds, though, the massive turnout for the event defied expectations and perhaps in its own way also signaled some strong motives from the developing countries in their posture for climate financing. Join me today on Climate Conundrum podcast to unpack what happened at COP30 and understand how climate finance pathways and the roadmap from Baku to Belem leaves us in this coming year.
What if tackling climate change starts with rethinking who holds power? I'm Candace Lewis-Wilson, Senior Program Director at Center for Public Impact.
And I'm Gabrielle Barron, Senior Program Manager in the Climate Action Team at the Centre for Public Impact. We're the new hosts of Reimagining Government. In Season 4, we're exploring what happens when those too often excluded from decision-making lead the way.
Across 6 episodes, we'll spotlight leaders who are transforming how we respond to the climate crisis.
They're redesigning cities, challenging climate colonialism, defending the Amazon, mobilizing global activism, and bringing youth voices into politics and policy. At its heart, this season isn't about carbon emissions.
It's about power, who has it, how it's shared, and how reimagining leadership from the ground up can reshape the future of government for everyone. Subscribe and listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Climate Conundrum podcast. I'm Sanika Devanji, and I'm very happy to be discussing a very important issue on today's episode, climate finance at COP30 from Baku to Belem. And joining me again this year is action.Dutt from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Arjun, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be back, Sanika. We are sort of crafting the sequel. Let's make it better than the original.
Yes, hope so. So I'm very grateful that after 40 hours or so grueling ride back, you're here still trying to piece together the information with us today. So thanks for that. How are you feeling though?
Yeah, so relieved that 40-hour thing is over. Long journey back home, as you can appreciate. But more importantly, relieved because the outcome of the conference of COP30 was set against rather complicated geopolitical context. We're talking about conflicts in parts of the world. There are rising trade barriers and economic slowdowns. And also this year and last year, we've seen reduction in development assistance from developed countries. And of course, there is an important country that skipped the conference and is basically on its way to exiting the Paris Agreement. So considering all that, the conference COP30 came through with quite a lot, right? A multifaceted plan for delivering climate finance in the form of the Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3T. There was announcements of plans to set up country platforms by several countries, including India, and which can help align investments with national climate priorities. And there was also a call for the tripling of adaptation finance. So all in all, not the worst outcome at all.
Well, mixed bag, but I'm glad you're hopeful. Last year, we recorded right before COP. So this time we're doing it after and going to do a sort of check on where things stand. To give people who are probably tuning in for the first time for this episode, in the last episode, we talked about climate finance, breaking down very basic concepts. So Arjun was very kind and patient to explain some of the basic finance terms, terminologies, things that have been mapped out over years of deliberation, and what developing countries, including India, especially India, could expect. This year, I think we're hoping to break down some of the further concepts that were developed this year and also understand why this was dubbed as the implementation COP. COP29 was known as the finance COP, but this time it was more on the lines of an implementation and a roadmap on how they're going to plan out and issue all of these theoretical concepts into practice.
That's right, Sanika. So this was the implementation COP because after a decade of finalizing the Paris rulebook, the idea was to act on them rather than setting new goals or targets. So implementation was sort of the mantra of COP30. And from that perspective, one of the important things was that while the last COP, the finance COP, sort of set the high level targets for the delivery of finance to developing countries, it also launched a work program known as the Baku to Belem Roadmap to 3T, which was to identify various levers that can actually help us accomplish those high level targets, that is, delivering $1.3 trillion by 2035 to developing countries. So that is what COP30 aspired to do from an implementation perspective for climate finance. So, for example, if you can, the Baku to Belem roadmap sort of provided a multiplicity of solutions to address a variety of challenges that could be standing in the way of delivering this capital. At the same time, at COP30, we saw the announcement of plans by several countries, including India, to set up what are called country platforms, sort of systems to coordinate the delivery of finance and align it with national priorities. And like I also said, there was also an announcement amid all this geopolitical turmoil of a call in the outcome text for the tripling of adaptation finance. And that itself, I would say, was an important win given the context. So some steps have been taken, or at least the initial starting point of what, from an implementation perspective, is important for climate finance has been accomplished. Now, of course, further steps are necessary to actually translate that into actual capital flows of a higher magnitude.
Exactly. And that's what I'm hoping to sort of unpack with you today, especially because there is this $3 trillion question. For those of you who might be interested to know a little more, Arjun has very nicely explained this on our previous episode. So I'll share a link. Please go and watch that one as well. But when negotiators arrived in Brazil this year, what did you think was the mood? Was it hopeful, impatient? Were people resigned?
Yeah. Firstly, the mood was cautious, right? Amid all these shifting global priorities, the conflict, the trade barriers, economic uncertainty, and of course, one country choosing not to participate, negotiators, I would say, were realistic about how much progress could be made. But at the same time, there was not all doom and gloom. So I would say there was caution, but there was a cautious optimism, that I sort of felt was palpable when I actually reached Belem.
That's great. That's good to know, actually. Cautious optimism is better than a blind one, I guess. And if I have to insist, I know it's a hard ask, but if I have to insist that you sum up in one line what you thought COP30 could actually deliver on climate finance, what would it be?
Okay, so just briefly, I think I sort of already alluded to it. Think of it in a way that COP30 delivered or provided the solutions and systems that we need to deliver on climate finance.
Okay, that's great. And then what do you think it did not deliver? I know
Right.
there's a big fossil fuel undercurrent here, but I'll let you also give your thoughts.
I'll stick. That's an important thing, but that's also reflected in this. But it is reflected in what did not deliver, also from a climate finance perspective. I'll tell you what. So it did not deliver commitment, or in other words, the willingness to take action by developed countries. And this is important for putting all these plans into action to implement them. And this unwillingness or this lack of commitment was unsurprising if you consider that development assistance from them is expected to fall by 9 to 17% in 2025, on top of a 9% drop last year. This is all development assistance to the developing countries. And now this is also reflected in some of the other outstanding issues pertaining to climate finance. And I can talk about them sort of in the course of our conversation. But ultimately, this commitment is beyond the systems and solutions that were brought through by COP. You also need this commitment to actually implement them in the right spirit so that they're effective. So I would say that is the most important thing that it did not deliver. And that is sort of the underlying cause of all the symptoms that you see in terms of the unresolved issues. That's what I would say.
That has been a theme over the years. I mean, there have been so many discussions of how much money, the pledges that were given, but then tracking back on that or sort of leaving loose threads. We'll get to that. And I am very curious to dig in on that front as well. There's also the undercurrent of, not the undercurrent, actually, it was a major theme, the NCQG. So the new collective quantified goal that we spoke about and unpacked last time. But I wanted to know what development happened on that front this year as well. The previous episode, we also spoke about the loss and damage fund and new pathways to use these financial tools to accelerate the financial flows, not only in terms of the investment needed, but also the access part. And I think that's a crucial theme that came up this year about the access. How would developing countries actually be able to access and use these financial pledges and investments in the course of the year? So, with that context, I think my first main question to you would be, what is the biggest finance questions on the table at the start of COP30 officially?
Yeah. No, fair enough. I think you've done a fairly decent job of laying out that context. So we start with the NCQG because last year, the NCQG, just to refresh our memories, was the high level commitment to deliver $1.3 trillion in climate finance by 2035 per year to developing countries by all actors, and of which the developed world was to take the lead in mobilizing $300 billion. These were just high level commitments. So what the follow up that was necessary was developing the plan to mobilize this particular magnitude of finance. And this was to be developed through a consultative process under the aegis of the COP29 and the COP30 presidencies. And this was called the Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3T, 1.3T signifying 1.3 trillion. So as a follow-up to the NCQG, this plan was what was developed over the course of the year, taking inputs from parties to the Paris Agreement, also non-party stakeholders such as ourselves. We ourselves submitted our own recommendations to this roadmap, and I'm happy to sort of report that a lot of them were sort of reflected in the roadmap itself. So, and this roadmap was published just before COP, just before the commencement of COP. So this was one of the main sort of follow-ups from last year, right? There are also other sort of outstanding issues. You already alluded to the fact that there are, and these are sort of enduring issues, a challenge in accessing funding from the likes of the Green Climate Fund and Global Environment Facility, which are sort of institutions under the UNFCCC through which finance is rooted. They're not the only ones. MDBs are also play a significant role, as do bilateral agencies, but these particular institutions are under the UNFCCC. So each of these institutions has their own rules of engagement as to how to access. And it's quite a complicated procedure for developing countries to actually access that capital. So that is an enduring issue that persisted. Loss and damage fund you mentioned, it remains insufficiently capitalized. Currently, the pledges are of the order of $800 million. We estimate, and there are other estimations, that the requirements will be more like $400 billion per year by 2030 or something of that magnitude. So, of course, current pledges are a paltry or a drop in the ocean compared to the actual requirements. But there were also other issues that were sort of, prominent at the beginning or during COP30. One of this was the implementation of Article 9.1. I'll explain what this is. Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement calls for developed countries to provide public finance to support climate action in developing countries. And the debate over Article 9.1 concerns the scope and enforceability of developed country financial obligations. Now, the issue is about developed countries giving credible signals on providing financing. So a move from 300 billion that they are supposed to take the lead on to 1.3 trillion, the overall requirements per year by 2035 in external finance for developing countries, is only possible when we can first reach $300 billion. Now, developing countries rightly want to hold developed countries to their promises, but developed countries insist that this discussion fits only within the broader contours of the NCQG that was determined last year, the overall goal. So ultimately, a decision was made to establish a 2-year work program on climate finance, including on Article 9.1, context of Article 9 as a whole. What does this mean? Article 9 collectively deals with provision and mobilization of finance for developing countries. Provision and mobilization. And conflating Article 9.1 with the wider aspects of Article 9 may dilute the focus on public capital to be provided by developed countries.
Correct.
So instead, the negotiations will collectively talk about public and private sources, which reduces the scrutiny on the contributions of developed country governments. So that's one sort of an issue, and the resolution was not the best from a developing country perspective. Another issue, and these are sort of nuances and technicalities of negotiations, but it's important issues, so I'm sort of talking about them. Another is the complementarity between Article 9 and 2.1c. Again, I'll explain what this is. Article 2.1c calls for, it literally says something like making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Something along those lines, right? Now, developing countries are wary of literal interpretations of this part of the Paris Agreement, that is, interpretation without qualification, because they view this as ways for developed countries to shift the burden of climate finance onto them.
Right.
So the outcomes noted that there are concerns that Article 2.1c, the concerns that I talked about. So it noted concerns of developing countries that 2.1c should be complementary, but no substitute for Article 9. Efforts under 2.1c should be undertaken in a nationally determined manner, not from a top-down approach. And further development on this matter will continue under a dialogue called the Veritas Dialogue, a new dialogue that is set up. So this is what was the outcome of 2.1c and Article 9. And then there was adaptation finance. So one of the important things to be determined at this year's COP on adaptation was determining the indicators with which to measure progress in terms of adaptation, right?
Very
Concurrent,
important, right? Because
yeah,
currently there's a lot of discussion and debate about the validity and the accuracy, because there are so many different ways in which we measure and the tools that are set up. So is that the same that this is referring to?
yeah. So in a related manner, basically it's about indicators of progress on adaptation. So if you are developing a plan, let's say if you're how to measure if you're becoming a more climate resilient country, what are those indicators? So under the global goal on adaptation, those indicators were finalized at this year's COP, right? But concurrently, this was under the global goal on adaptation. Concurrently, from a finance perspective, there was also a debate on scaling up adaptation finance, because if you have to make progress, you also have to have more finance available. So the outcome, this is one of the wins for developing countries, called for a trebling of adaptation finance by 2035. But this is within the context of the overall NCQT, the overall $300 billion that developed countries have to take the lead on. So that hasn't changed, but they have explicitly said that the adaptation finance will be trebled. So all these issues were sort of the finance related issues. Some of them are quite, technical and speaking to specific aspects of the negotiations, but they're also important nonetheless.
That is a lot to unpack. But I think summing up, the core of what I hear from you still remains that developing nations are still in a flux to try and see when and how the finances will be actually released. Whereas developed countries, the reasons are not to be judged here, but at the heart of it are trying to elbow their way to not release or take ownership of the pledges that were set out initially, but hide behind the facade of the NCQG or the nationally determined contributions that so far not all countries have even released or have.
Yeah, so I think ownership is a good word that you used here. I mean, while on plan, those targets are there, right? But all of these debates happen because there isn't that commitment, from the developed world, right? So, for example, even India, when it talks about what it wants from climate finance flows, it says very clearly that firstly, the definition of climate finance itself is not clear, right? All types of finance flows are counted. India says that finance flows that are additional and grant based should be counted. So by additional, what they mean is that existing development aid that is non-climate related should not be reclassified as climate and counted as climate, because that is one of the criticisms of the reporting of under the OECD, by the OECD, right? And they also say that the finance flows on commercial terms should not be counted because that can be raised by countries anyway. And what's the point of counting them under this special arrangement of climate finance? So that's one thing, right? And obviously, not enough of this has flowed. That's a reflection of ownership, right? But there are also other issues. We talked about the challenges with access for multilateral climate funds. And I'll say even MDBs, the other things that there is transparency is a problem with respect to the flows and the extent of climate relevance of projects, etc. But also India talks about how there is disproportionate representation of the developed world in their governance of these MDBs and multilateral climate funds. And so India's G20 presidency also called for reform of MDBs to make them better suited to funding development, including climate action. Even this agenda has not moved because this requires the approval of sovereign shareholders, where developed countries hold a considerable influence. So all of this is a reflection of what you said. They're not taking ownership. So all these issues will not move rapidly. And therefore, the finance that needs to be delivered, you can have delivery without them, but that will not be as effective. So that's the challenge.
I mean, the discussions have already moved on to the G20 now. We'll come to that later. Arjun, India co-authored the Circular Finance Ministers report this year. And that is a coalition that produced this really sort of integral, crucial report basically calling for doubling of concessional finance, reforming MDBs like you just mentioned earlier, MDBs or multilateral development banks, and aligning funds through basically country platforms that came up also as a really important part of the discussions this COP30. In fact, the presidency was lauded for using this new idea of country platforms to deliberate or move forward the negotiations. But you briefly mentioned what India's own priorities were right now. But in a nutshell, if you had to just sum it up for everyone, what were India's priorities or asks and stands in the negotiation?
So India's stand, I mean, in general, is that, like I said, the climate finance should be grant-based. Now, India, when I talk about some of the other issues, India does want developed countries to be held accountable under Article 9.1. So India was on that side of the debate in terms of developed countries coming through with providing public finance. Now, unfortunately, that has been packaged into a separate sort of conversation. India is also on the side of the Article 2.1c debate, where they say that it should not be Article 2.1c is no substitute for Article 9. Developed countries have their responsibility to provide this. And 2.1c is complementary, should be in a determinate, nationally determined manner. So that is the side of the debate that India has. So in addition to this, the stuff that I've already talked about, the finance being concessional, the finance being additional, the call for MTB reform, which stems from India's G20 presidency. So the Indian G20 presidency and then the succeeding Brazilian G20 presidency both took out reports or roadmaps for the reform of MDBs. So again, India is for the reform of MDBs and better representation also of developing countries in terms of governance, etc. And you mentioned the Circle of Finance Ministers report. Yes, that was a very important report. And there was a mutual reinforcement of messaging between the Circle of Finance Ministers report, the Baku to Belem roadmap, and the fourth report of the International High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance. All of these had sort of mutually reinforcing messaging. And so did our report at CW, our policy brief, which sort of, because we had submitted our policy brief for the considerations of the presidencies in determining the Baku to Belem roadmap. Yeah. So it touches upon several issues, and I'd be happy to talk about them because you mentioned some of them. But again, there are more issues. And because the idea is that there are various challenges that developing countries face in being able to mobilize finance. So how can those challenges be addressed is what the recommendations speak to.
No, absolutely. And that's such an important discussion surrounding climate finance itself, because I did see the report and I think succinctly emphasize on the same idea of the country platforms, but I'm going to let you talk about other details of the report. I'm also wondering which of those were actually appreciated, taken up, and you find hopeful that they might be absorbed or might get stuck in negotiation mode.
Right. So at a high level, most of these recommendations were reflected in some way or the other, in the sense that not precisely in the way that we had framed them, but across the reports, there is quite a lot of similarity. So that is a great sort of, sign from our perspective that at least our recommendations found resonance with what these other reports also published. But I'll briefly, like you said, I'll talk about some of the challenges and also the specific recommendations, the country platforms and beyond. So I'll start with the specific challenges because it's important from the context of why the recommendations. Firstly, in order to take climate action, a lot of developing countries struggle because a lot of them are heavily indebted. They have a lot of sovereign debt. 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on servicing interest on sovereign debt than they spend on health or education.
Yes.
So 3.4 billion is 40% of the world's population lives in such countries. So if you can't spend on those developmental priorities, climate action again takes a back seat, right? So that's one thing that needs to be addressed. Developing countries also have smaller domestic financial systems, their banks and bond markets as a percentage of GDP, relative to the developed world. So therefore, it makes it harder for them to make a transformation towards low carbon and climate resilient entities because this requires an economy-wide transformation. And then the cost of finance is higher in developing countries for the same type of projects or technologies because of both risks associated with investing in developing countries, economy-wide risks, and then there's some sector-specific risks with respect to investments in certain sectors, but also the credit ratings that are assigned to developing countries. In some cases, there's some evidence that ratings agencies may not be trusting data from developing countries, and they may be using their own rules of thumb, which may result in risk perceptions that artificially worsen credit ratings. So that also translates into higher cost of capital. So these are some of the challenges that have to be addressed if we are talking about mobilizing finance for developing countries. And here we're talking particularly about the external finance, 1.3 trillion, which is part of the 3.2 that has to be mobilized per year by 2035. So what do we suggest? First, we say that the developing countries themselves, in together with their country platform partners, have to demonstrate credible commitment to climate action. How should they do so? They have to develop enabling policy environments for investments and also financial systems to enable them. For this, we have recommended the development of sectoral policies for decarbonization and resilience across sectors like power, transport, sanitation,
The
buildings,
most
etc.
important.
Right? They have to put in place policies. Then they also need to have, besides these sectoral policies, cross-cutting levers like taxonomies and disclosures that help connect capital with investment opportunities. And then financial supervisors, regulators in these countries have to accelerate the greening of their financial systems, meaning to incorporate climate considerations into regulations so that climate aligned investments become more attractive, right? So these things they have to do to demonstrate their own willingness to take climate action. And in this context, we also suggest, and as do other reports that I talked about, that peer-to-peer learning from one global south country to another can be a useful way to disseminate best practices. So in fact, we went as far as to suggest that large emerging economies that lead in climate action could set up centers of excellence to help facilitate the capacity building of policymakers and regulators from smaller countries. So that's one sort of a thing, right, that developing countries themselves should do. Another thing is we need to free up fiscal space that is stuck right now in servicing sovereign debt. So over here, a variety of levers are possible. Debt for nature and debt for climate swaps are one type of instrument that can help free up some space. It's also possible to roll over the existing sovereign debt at lower interest rates or longer tenures. And in some cases, debt restructuring with principal reductions may become necessary. So each instrument can be applied on a case-to-case basis as appropriate. Besides these immediate measures, there's also a need to address the structural underlying problems causing indebtedness. This is where IMF supported programs under its Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and Resilience and Sustainability Trust could be useful. And we could also consider disaster clauses in sovereign debt so that if there's a disaster, that doesn't inordinately burden a country that's already struggling with other challenges in servicing debt. And once this, fiscal space is cleared up, the idea we recommended is to align budgeting with SDGs. So SDG aligned budgeting can then help direct public resources towards development, including climate action. So that's the second sort of and arguably governments are already spending on SDGs. It's about putting in place ways to track so that more finance can be directed in that direction. So that's one sort of a addition, right? And then you see, like I said, that the commitment from the developed world is not coming through loud and clear. So South-South cooperation through South-led multilateralism was another recommendation that we made. And again, this found resonance, particularly in the IHLEG's fourth report. So what we have suggested is that there are a number of international finance hubs in developing countries, such as GIFT IFSC in India.
Yes.
So we suggest developing these international finance hubs as conduit of climate finance to the global south, that is servicing countries beyond the home country. So GIFT IFSC potentially serving other countries as well, not just India. And for this purpose, we recommend global south-led MDBs, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the New Development Bank, setting up or anchoring green banks in these financial hubs to then offer services such as project preparation, aggregation, and de-risking of portfolios to develop investment-ready portfolios for investors. And once this is done, we also suggest cross-investment from one developing country into another developing country's markets, because then a conducive environment has been created for investments. So that's the third recommendation that we have. The fourth one was on adaptation, again, an area that has traditionally been financially underserved. And traditionally, international finance under the UNFCCC has been heavily skewed towards mitigation.
Right.
So we recommended a rebalancing of this and optimization for greater emphasis on adaptation. So that's the fourth sort of thing. On mitigation, while on adaptation, we say that all countries should be supported because this is an important challenge across developing countries. In mitigation, while all countries should ideally be supported, given that generally capital is constrained, we say that target deployment and do this in a targeted manner of capital to support mitigation in countries that have high energy requirements and high clean energy potential. We say that you should underwrite country-related risks in these specific locations because this can facilitate low-cost capacity addition. So if there is high clean energy potential and high, let's say, solar irradiation, if you couple that with de-risking in the form of country risks, you can pair the potential with low cost of capital and then have electricity generated for cheap.
Right.
Now, the thing to bear in mind is that any GHG emitted anywhere in the world, right, has the same effect on average temperature rise. So if you're using public capital, global public capital, international public capital to de-risk mitigation, this should be done in the most impactful center. So we suggest targeting these type of high energy requirement and high clean energy potential countries. And then we say that if decarbonization in these countries exceeds the levels that are anticipated by their NDCs, the excess mitigation outcomes can be exported, either through interconnected electricity grids as proposed by India through its OSOWOG initiative, which is now also sort of backed by ISA, or through by producing green hydrogen or green ammonia and exporting these to other countries. And on top of this, we suggest other innovative sort of sources such as carbon markets, rechanneling of SDRs, and so on, right? So this was for mitigation. And final, so circling back to the point that you made about MDB reform. So we say that we need to bolster the capacity to do all this. You need money, you need to bolster capacity of development finance institutions, MDBs, but we also say DFIs at all levels. We also argue for the integration of domestic DFIs from developing countries into country platforms because they're the best suited to understand local financing bottlenecks and opportunities. And besides the MDBs, we say that, while reform agenda will proceed at its own pace, these institutions should also focus on trying to mobilize private capital through mechanisms such as ring-fence funds managed by them, but where they pool in capital from institutional investors. And lastly, when it comes to country platforms, we also suggest bringing in credit ratings agencies to facilitate better rating assessments of developing countries, and also creditors to facilitate debt resolution. So this, as you can see, is a spectrum of recommendations that includes steps that developing countries can take by themselves. It includes steps that rely on South-South cooperation.
Correct.
And it also relies on steps where you are using smart use of capital from the global north. So everybody has to sort of contribute because this is a global commons, and facilitating climate action in developing countries is in everybody's interest. So that's how we've tried to frame our recommendations, which has also been mirrored in the Baku to Belem roadmap and the IHLEG report, as well as the Circular Finance Minister's report.
Now, these are in-depth and cover a broad range of spectrum. But I think I also wanted to simplify it a little for people who may not entirely understand a lot of the ways in which these micro suggestions or different mechanisms come out. Would you be able to explain one or two of these through an example? Brazil championing this tropical forest protection mechanism. I think it's called Tropical Forest Protection Finance
Tropical Forest Forever Facility.
Or there's also the debt relief mechanism. But if you had to explain this through an example, what comes to your mind?
So there are a number of mechanisms. So the debt relief mechanism, let's say a debt for climate or a debt for nature swap. Effectively, what that does is that creditors of a particular indebted developing country agree to either forgive part of the debt or allow for more favorable terms for its repayment in exchange for the country using the proceeds, the freed up capital, to invest in certain areas such as climate or nature, right? So that is a way in which existing debt that they're unable to pay or they're facing challenges can be redirected towards climate action, right? So it serves a dual purpose. Now, while this has happened, and this has particularly been utilized by some of the climate vulnerable countries in the Caribbean, where
These have
Barbados, etc.,
Yeah.
have sort of used these quite effectively.
Correct.
This can further benefit if standardized frameworks are developed to value nature and price emissions, because then that can make this process standardized. It becomes easier to figure out the trade of debt for climate and nature, right? So that's one sort of a thing that can be that found mention in all the reports that I'm talking about, and we are also sort of recommended. Another is a climate resilient clause in sovereign debt. So what that means is that ordinarily, right, if you've borrowed from overseas, you're bound to pay back principal and interest on on your borrowing. But you can, or some countries have started, and again, Barbados is one of those that has sort of been, among the leaders in this, incorporate a clause that if there is, in the event of a disaster or a disaster of a certain magnitude, that repayment will be suspended for a little while, right? And again, there can be certain conditions under which that payment is suspended and when it will resume. So what it does is that in a situation where a disaster has struck and public resources have to be spent towards recovery and rehabilitation, that amount of fiscal space is not taken up in servicing debt. So I think these types of clauses are important given the reality of the macroeconomic situation in various countries and the extent of damage that can be caused. Because for a small country, for a large country, a large disaster may cause 10% of GDP as damage. For a small island country, it can even be more than 100% of GDP in some extreme cases.
Yeah, that is the debt trap that most developing countries and small island nations have been talking about. This, in fact, Barbados is one of my favorite when it comes to discussions and putting forth these arguments in a very assertive way. But it also is needed today, where examples like these could encourage more pathways or investments to also flow freely with these clauses and normalizing that this happens. But
Right.
Arjun, I'm going to actually try and you can help me if I'm not clear here, but I'm going to try and sort of put these ideas into a few buckets to simplify them. One, what I hear you say is money flows obviously between government to other governments through bilateral aid. That is one pathway for climate finance flows. Then there is the private institutions and private investments that directly invest in projects, different funds, any particular project that is already ongoing or is in plans. There's also the multilateral development banks, like we spoke about, where they lend or guarantee finance. There's a lot of innovation that has been put forth in that, scaling that up. There is then a blended approach where private, public both come together. Climate bonds is one more bucket that we see. And is there something else that I'm missing out where we can simplify and sort of, for a layman's perspective, get these tools, approaches easier to understand?
Sure. So there's a lot there, but to keep it simple. So climate bonds are a type of instrument to raise debt. Debt is a specific type of capital, but because there's a much larger landscape that you covered, a simple way to think about this is firstly that money can come from governments, that is public sources, or private sector, right? So that's one sort of segmentation. Then another segmentation is domestic and international. You can have public and private coming into a particular country from international sources, or you can have public and private from domestic sources. So public-private can have those two layers. Another layer can be concessional or market reflective. Market reflective means that you want a return that's commensurate with your risk. So typically, private sector investors invest seeking market reflective returns, right? And concessional capital is basically seeking lesser than market reflective rates, and if the return sought is zero, it's a grant, and that serves a developmental purpose to get money flowing, for example, where it is not flowing. And so blended finance, another term that you mentioned, is basically the strategic use of public capital that's usually concessional to bring in private capital by taking on some of the risk, and where money was not flowing initially, money is now flowing.
Right.
So that's, let's say, the basic sort of setup. And when we say, you talk about some of these institutions, typically international capital, international public capital particularly, can be routed through a variety of ways. It can come from bilateral development agencies like AFD or USAID, FCDO, right, from various developed countries. So that is an example of bilateral agencies. Another thing is multilateral development banks, as an example of multilateral institutions. So the shareholders of these institutions are basically countries across the world, right? And the developed countries have larger shareholdings. So the monies that are flowing from these MDBs to developing countries, the portion of this that can be attributed to developed countries are again an example of international climate finance flows coming from those countries. But that's just an example of international public capital.
Thank you. That actually lucidly explains some of these big terminologies. I think at the risk of dumbing it down, I also wanted to make sure we don't lose out people, where if you throw out a lot of these financial terms, most people just get alienated and say, this is not for me, I'm going to run away. I am one of those people. So
no, we don't want that. Please don't run away. And I'd be happy to, explain further. But certainly you raise an important point. So this should also be accessible in an accessible manner. And I hope that your podcast and others can sort of make that accessible, where certain terminology, etc., can put people off.
Yeah. So at the heart of these ideas, we spoke a lot about the tools and the ways in which capital can flow is being proposed and currently is in just theory, but can actually become a reality. But the heart of the problem is developing countries are still saying they don't have enough funds to undertake these mitigation and adaptation efforts. Developed countries say they are also stuck because they need money for their own development works, for their own sort of requirements, priorities as well, actually. However, we know that there is enough money globally to actually cater to all of these demands and have some more. In fact, this year, UN released a report about the global military spendings in 2024 alone. And I can't help but bring this up. I know there's no answer to this as such, or a question is more rhetorical, but in just 2024 alone, there was a global military spending of $2.7 trillion. That's a big number. Honestly, that's more than double of what developing countries are collectively asking for. So, in a nutshell, we have the money. Now, where is this problem? Where is the problem? Every year COP comes around, discussions happen, but at the heart of it, this question still remains of why the money is not accessible.
That's a very important point, and I think there are two layers to this, right? First is that, how do I phrase it? So finance, it doesn't lead, it follows. So it's a bit like a Latin dance, like doing the salsa. You can only make your partner execute a particular turn if you give the right lead. So finance will only flow in the direction where it gets a lead. So if we don't have the appropriate incentives, that is, if we're not pricing in climate risk accurately, then certain types of climate projects, etc., may not be lucrative. Whereas in reality, if you have a project that is trying to has elements of adaptation, that is improving climate vulnerability, if those benefits are actually priced in, it may become more lucrative. So one is actually accurately pricing or internalizing the externalities of emissions, that is the damage that emissions cause, and the benefits that resilience investment create. So if we are able to internalize this in the form of regulation, financial regulation, that can help bend the flow of capital away from other end users towards climate. And this is an endeavor that various financial regulators are at the initial stages of, right? So, for example, taxonomies are a tool to identify the important areas where money needs to be directed. On the basis of the taxonomy, you can craft various incentives, right? So you have climate-related risk disclosures for financial institutions. Again, this is a way of nudging them to
be more transparent,
measure their climate risk, and then direct capital in a manner that helps mitigate that risk. Now, you mentioned military spending. I also mentioned COVID-19. At that time, much more money than 2.7 trillion was mobilized. That's because both developed and developing countries were being equally impacted, and therefore a lot of money was provided for a variety of ways to combat COVID-19. And we saw with COVID-19, a lot of finance was made available in a very short period of time because that issue was taken seriously by both developed and developing world. So the same may not happen, but other mechanisms have to be sort of worked upon to get developed countries on board with supporting developing countries. And of course, developing countries equally have to be serious about taking action by themselves and also collaborating between themselves.
I think this year's presidency also used the same rhetoric quite a bit, where the idea of collective and collaborative pathways was emphasized in various ways. That does make sense because we cannot move forward in this global fight without an actual empathy that extends beyond national boundaries. So I think this entire discussion ends and starts there, where the financial mechanisms are not boundary bound, so to say, but have to be more open to reviving the current systems and at the same time innovating as well. Is there any innovative example that you found was really interesting, could actually have a lot of potential in being realistic now?
So I would say that I'm also conscious, while it's important for developing world to collaborate, the developing world also has to sort of take the lead particularly in the current context. So my point, or what I would suggest is that, and what we are also sort of suggesting, is the South-South cooperation angle, where if an AIIB or an NDB were to set up a green bank in a gift IFSC that services not just India, but other developing countries also, the financial firepower of an AIIB combined with the platform that is gift IFSC can service various developing countries concurrently and offer a variety of services such as de-risking, aggregation, project preparation. And by the way, this is also important because now we're coming to the end of 2025. 2026 is when India assumes the BRICS presidency. And last year was the first occasion when the BRICS issued a leaders' declaration on climate finance. So climate finance is also an important topic for that forum. And moving forward, 2028 is when India aspires to host COP33, or India is hoping to host COP33. So we have a runway moving on from this Global South presidency of COP30 to a BRICS presidency, that is led by India, and potentially another COP in 2028 held in India. So given that this is the sort of setup, there's an incentive for these large emerging economies like India and Brazil, China to sort of come together and sort of craft solutions. So I'm not saying that these solutions have to be just exclusive to these countries. The participation from the developed world and their institutions are welcome to bolster the capacity, because like I said, to really sort of scale up, you need the financial heft that they bring in. But I would say that these mechanisms are perhaps the most practical because there already is a coalition of the willing. The global South countries want to act, they want to help each other. And these countries, particularly the large emerging economies, also have the means to at least do something of their own. And of course, they should be then supported by the developed world. Because you mentioned the COP30 presidency, they used the word mutirao, right? Global collective action, to bring them in for this mutirao.
Thank you. That absolutely makes sense. And it also resonates with the same recommendations that you all put together prior to the COP30. In fact, there's a lot of events, as you rightly mentioned earlier, many events lined up where India and Global South is going to take a leading role. And there's a lot more channels and opportunities that I'm hopeful about it. But we are at the end of the road on this discussion. It's almost an hour long one, but I think it was needed to really get into the depths of some of these. In fact, we're not even deep enough. We've just scratched the surface.
It's a long road because it's a long financing roadmap. So it's only fitting,
Exactly. So what next? Another year, another COP has gone by. What does this tell you about the coming year, and what do you think is going to lead up to COP31?
Well, particularly from a financing perspective, it's important while we have a roadmap now, we have to sort of flesh it out further, right? So the outcome text only took note of the Baku to Belem roadmap. If they were more proactive, if the commitment was there, they could have set up a working group to advance the recommendations of the Baku to Belem roadmap. So different actors may work at different speeds because of their motivations, and also the opportunity with the BRICS presidency, with COP33. So BRICS presidency will be leading up to
roadmap a little better. And
absolutely. And so I started with something that the developing world can do. And of course, the other steps, the sort of 6-point framework that I laid out, is important to actually flesh them out. Right now, it's a good starting point. So at least we have that. And even that is, not a given in the current sort of global context. So moving forward, not just COP31, but beyond, it's about figuring out how to implement this, because scaling up from where we're at now to 1.3 trillion in 2035 is going to take some doing. And therefore, a lot of work has to happen. And it's about the plan that is in place is there. But now, how do you make it a reality is what the world has to sort of work on. Cautiously up. Fingers crossed,
Yes. Arjun, thank you so much. This was really, really useful, and I hope people find this useful as well. As always, if you have any questions, send them his way, not mine.
Happy to answer them.
We'll be happy to take these discussions forward and continue these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. It was lovely conversation, and happy to answer questions. Thank you for having me again on your show. Like I said, hopefully the sequel is better than the original.